use the word emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus. You have accessed entry 1409.NH0109, certificate number 24737. The war before this one.
It may well be that the final extinction of a baleful domination will pave the way to a broader solidarity of all the men in all the land than we could ever have planned if we had not marched together through the fire.
So listeners have just been in a tizzy since finding out that I'm in the middle of reading Anthony Pohl's classic of 20th century literature, A Dance to the Music of Time, which I mentioned in an earlier entry.
Have listeners really been in a tizzy?
Oh, boy. My phone is just ringing out there. People want to know, Ken, what volume are you on? How's it going?
How many volumes are there?
It's a 12-volume work. It's well over 1 million words.
Are you reading all 12 volumes?
Yeah. Well, we're on volume 8 right now.
What do you mean we? Are you reading it as part of a group?
A small group of me and my wife. It's our COVID reading club.
Really? You
Yes.
decided to read a 12-volume history.
I like ambitious goals.
Have you read...
It's not really a history. It's a history of it's a fictionalized Proustian memoir of his life woven into 20th century history.
Oh, so it's a series of novels.
Yes, and they're funny.
Have you read the Gulag Archipelago?
I read A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in high school, but the Gulag Archipelago is that on steroids, right? Isn't it like some 2,000-page version of that?
Yeah, it's 3 volumes, and they're all as big as cinder blocks.
Is that your brag-worthy literary feat? Is reading that?
No, it's just it's one of these. It's like my struggle. It's like News Nardgard.
I'm 2/3 of the way through Knausgard.
Through which one?
No, I'm 2/3 of the way through the whole thing. I just finished book 4.
No, I just always wonder, like, how when you're into reading multi-volume autobiographies, like that just was the first one for me. That's the big one, and it's I wouldn't say that it's like super fun
until you finish that. You're never going to read another book. You're never going to read the Robert Caro LBJ books until you get done with.
I'm only 15 pages from the end, but I just can't conquer those last 15.
It does become a little bit like binge watching TV, where it becomes, where the 8th episode is not as good as the first episode.
Yeah,
and maybe I would benefit from spacing it out a little more.
It's like the 4th Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
But I've been, the Dance to the Music of Time cycle starts out with his, his youth in sparkling London, going to all the coming out balls and the crazy. I mean, it starts out in his boarding school, actually. But
in the 19th or 20th century?
Early 20th century. He's a child of a military background. His dad actually served in the First World War. And
those were the days.
You kind of read about, the glittering, fancy, artistic set in London between the wars.
When you could still afford servants.
And he's very clever about weaving in different social classes. Here's what the artists are doing. Here's the weird causes my writer friends are getting into. Here's the weird girls they're slumming with. Here's the fancy rich girl that the cabinet minister keeps cheating on his wife with. There's lots of stuff like this. But
Did he have no agenda? I mean, was he just an observer?
Political agenda?
Well, just like, did he have any viewpoint?
He's a lifelong Tory, but not not a weird one.
Sure. He's one of the good Tories.
Putting goldfishes up his bum or whatever British conservative politicians are always doing.
Yeah, I mean, if you put a goldfish up your bum, you're going to be prime minister. That just
is that how it works?
Just how it goes. Yeah.
I thought it was a pig, like in the first Black Mirror. No, he tends to the book. He almost comically divorces his own viewpoint from things. Like he uses his narrator character is just kind of a point of view character to show you the funny things that happen at the parties in his set. To the degree that when people speak to him, he will almost always say something non-committal and dull. And no matter what people say to him, he tends to tell the reader, when it came to it, he had a point. Like he'll hear some awful point of view and he'll be like, that is something people say. He's almost comically detached as a cool, wry British observer.
Right.
But in the 7th, 8th, and 9th books, where I am now,
Humble brag.
The milieu. What's humble? I guess I haven't finished.
Brag.
The milieu abruptly turns to World War II. We get into the late 30s, early 40s. There's a book where everybody's talking about this appalling Hitler and what might happen in Europe. And then there's 3 books, at least, I think, I'm in the trenches of it now, set during World War II.
There weren't trenches in World War II.
In the tanks. What's the World War II equivalent of being in the trenches?
Let's see, being in a B-17 bomber.
Yeah, I'm in the bombers.
Yeah.
He, being from a wealthy military family, he's able to get, he pulls some strings and manages to get a commission.
In the cavalry?
He's in some kind of Welsh, his dad is cavalry. The Welsh division he winds up with is, I think, it looks like he's about to get some cushy...
The Fusiliers,
it looks
the
like
Flautists.
the Fusiliers, the Grenadiers. I think it might be
Grenadiers.
But it looks like at the point where I am, he's about to get into some maybe cushy London intelligence or logistical type job. His French...
Those were hard. Those people were fighting that war as much as anybody.
Well, the book I'm reading right now, in the 8th book, he's on leave in London for much of it. And it's actually just a way of kind of showing you into the Blitz. You see which of his friends dies when a restaurant gets bombed, where they're having a party on the wrong night. So it's kind of an eye-opening look at war, both in the World War II, both at the home front, the Battle of Britain, and wherever he's going to wind up, liaising with the Free French or something. But what's interesting about reading these parts of the book is he's discussing both the First and Second World Wars in a time where there is not an established name for either.
What? Oh,
for either war.
The First War was the Great War, and then the Second War was in progress.
The even greater war.
You couldn't tell how great it was going to be.
It really is an eye-opening look at how the names and even the framing, the way the narrativization of historical periods does not happen until long after.
Really?
Right. And he wrote all these books in the 60s. He was writing these books into the 60s and 70s, but the retrospective looks back. And he could very easily have said, and then World War II started. The Prime Minister wired us to say, World War I has just begun. But he kind of writes them in the vernacular of the time, which means I kind of kept notes of all the ways he referred to World War I in the books set in the run-up and during the Second World War.
What are some of those?
He never says the Great War, interestingly.
Really?
It's always...
Because that was also retroactive.
That it turns out that is a little retroactive. This is what made me kind of dig into this, something I never thought about. Because if you're born in our era, World War I and World War II seem like they've always existed as nomenclature. And every subsequent war that we have knowledge of or experienced seem to have some out-of-the-box name. There's Korea. There's Vietnam. None of these had to be reframed by historical lens.
Well, from our lens, I'm sure the Vietnamese don't call it the Vietnam War.
That's an interesting question.
The War of Western Aggression.
A very common way to name war is to name it for the theater in which it happened. But of course, that only makes sense for the colonial power dipping their toes for the first time into that theater.
Well, and in that sense, World War II uses that same template. That was the theater, the world.
Yeah, and but there are other options. There are, as we'll see, there's wars named after the two. Well, let me ask you in
Franco-Prussian War.
I'll ask you in a second. since I happen to have looked this up, it would be ridiculous for the Vietnam War to be called the Vietnam War in Vietnam, which has seen many wars come and go.
Right. Or probably Korean, even in Korea, they probably don't call it the Vietnam War, do they?
They may have, oh, you mean they don't call it the Korean War?
No, the Koreans don't call the Vietnam War.
Oh, that's interesting. What do
War.
other Asian cultures call it?
Right.
In Vietnam, the funny thing is, do you know what it's called?
They call it the American War.
They call it the American War.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Because it's essentially what now these guys,
right? The French War, the
French,
Japanese
the Chinese. War. They've been getting it from all sides.
But
and now of all people, now the Americans have crossed an ocean.
I'm sure the Vietnamese cannot call things the Chinese War and the Japanese War because there've been multiple.
Right.
Like misadventures, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true.
First Chinese War, second Chinese War.
So we've talked on the Omnibus about one of the ways in which you name wars.
We're talking about it now.
We've talked about, in the past, we've talked about naming them through cool, propagandistic, kind of technology code name heavy naming, Operation Operation Desert Storm, Operation Enduring Freedom.
Claw.
But that has not always been an option. I think the Chinese, the official name for the Vietnam War in Vietnam is the Resistance War Against America, which is, I imagine, still the party line in China as well. That was the Resistance War Against America. Getting back to Anthony Powell, he calls it the last war. World War I is the last war.
Now, wait, does he mean the war to end all wars?
No, he means the previous war.
The previous.
Yes.
Because the war to end all wars was also a post-war coinage.
A post-World War I coinage. Maybe
it's a Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. Which, spoilers, turned out to not be true.
Right.
That's one that didn't age well.
Too bad. Well,
you never want to name your movie the biggest box office hit ever.
Apparently 1990 was not the end of history either.
I wonder how that book sells in reprint. It sells as well as Dow 30,000. So he calls it interchangeably the last war and the first war, which is pretty funny.
Huh.
Last meaning most recent, first meaning
first
war of our era, of our generation. It's most often called the 14 to 18 war.
Oh, okay, sure. The War of 1812.
With little apostrophes, yes. And so that's one way you can name a war. You can name it by the dates it took place. And that will not be ambiguous because other parts of the world were at war in 1812, but in an American or Anglo-American context, the War of 1812.
But the Anglos called the War of 1812 either the French and Indian War or that was part of the Napoleonic Wars, right?
It is. They do consider it as part of the Napoleonic Wars. And in fact, an interesting thing about the American Revolution is from the other side, that's often just considered as, we consider it as a foundational event in human history. In Britain, it's just one of a string of
minor
entanglements that had French people in it.
Right. I think they think of it as more than that, but and sometimes it's still taught as, for one thing, they never say the American Revolution, which is customary here. Certainly not the Revolutionary War, right?
Which to us really emphasizes, because of the accident of the double meaning of revolutionary, it emphasizes the unprecedented nature of the conflict. To them, it's just the American War for Independence. And more colloquially, they'll still say the Rebellion of the Colonies.
Harumph. Well, and they've had a civil war too, so they wouldn't refer to the English Civil War. Do they? I guess they must say the American Civil War for the Civil War.
Yeah, the American Civil War. The American Civil War we'll discuss later. It's often referred to in non-Western cultures. Their name for it is often the war between North and South in America.
Right, or the war between the states. But even that wouldn't make any sense if you were...
Right, you have to say in America.
Right.
There's states in Brazil and Mexico,
and then there's the 30 Years' War and the 100 Years' War.
Okay, well, that's another option. Length of war works. And just to explain the title of the episode, he says the 14 to 18 war a lot, kind of echoing War of 1812. At one point, he calls it the war before this one. And just colloquially, like people on the street were saying, hey, in the war before this one, my dad was... and so that was more common than saying the First World War.
Right. You would... Yeah,
that had not caught on yet.
I would probably say the last war, the war prior, right? I mean, it wasn't that long before. It was... 20 years.
It really wasn't. And it kind of seemed like a 1-2 punch. And you kind of wonder if at some point the futurelings will know this. Will the lens of history now be so distant? Will things be so flattened in the zoom lens of history that those will be considered the same war.
I mean,
That's what happens.
There's an awful case of that it should be.
Same
really.
opponent for the same reasons. The outcome of World War I and the treaties lead directly to the root causes that caused World War II. It's a very straight line.
Right, it was an unstable peace, just as it now seems. I mean, will we think of this era as Cold War Volume 2? But 20 years, I mean, this shirt I'm wearing is 20 years old, or I've owned it for 20 years.
You know, you talked about the option of naming wars by the period of time they cover, kind of the 14 to 18 war.
The best example of that is the 7-Day War. I really love those Israeli wars that are just like, well, it lasted 48 hours.
We mopped that up in no time. The opposite of that would be the 100 Years' War, of course.
Yeah, right.
But this is very parallel to the possibility that the futurelings may consider World War I and World War II part of the same, I don't know what they'll call it, the German War or something.
Yeah, European War.
Because at the time it was being fought, the 100 Years' War was considered to be 3 different wars.
Sure, right. And still you can study the 100 Years' War as 3 separate wars.
And it lasted like 116 years. So even 100 years is just, this whole thing stretched roughly a century. But there was not, we might have from the name of the war, you can get the wrong idea. The war was declared.
Right.
And about a century later, after a century of battles, peace finally won out.
It wasn't until the Swedes got involved that the thing really went off the rails.
The 3 phases of the 100 Years' War, I think, are often, in the UK at least, they're often called the Edwardian War. Maybe to global scholars. It's the various rulers and dynasties involved. The Edwardian War, the Lancastrian War, and the Carolinian War or something. And what you don't realize is that these are 3 fairly discrete wars with truces in between. Right. Between the first 2 phases, there's 9 years of peace. Between the second and third phase, there's a 26-year truce. Right. So longer than the World War I to II gap. And yet it wasn't until the 18th century that people started to refer to this century of kind of warfare centering on England and France as the 100 Years' War. And that was kind of cemented in 1823 when a very influential history was written by Crescent Ovide de Michel, and he called it the 100 Years' War. So like 400 years later. Finally, an influential historian gives a name good enough that it kind of becomes cemented.
I should say that when I mentioned the Swedes getting involved, I was referring to the 30 Years' War, not the 100 Years'
You're going to get letters still.
I know. Never mind, you people. I caught my mistake.
But this is a whole genre of war where the length of the war is what matters. The 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War.
Even if it's only a period of 100 years where war is the dominant flavor, or right. Rather, the antagonists come back and keep fighting.
But because there's some looseness, 9 years, you could easily say the 9 Years' War is a terrible way to refer to a war. Yes, and that's why other parties call it the War of the Grand Alliance or the War of the League of Augsburg. It kind of depends on which historical theory is in vogue, on which side has survived to write the history.
That's right. Who writes the history?
We're starting to get to a point where some historians are speaking of a second 100 Years' War between England and France, spanning everything from the late 17th century, the 9 Years' War at the end of the 1600s, all the way through the 100 Days and the end of Napoleon. Because that's
a second 100 Days or 100 Years' War. That's a
time period where European entanglements centered around an English-France rivalry extends for well over a century. And you could consider that 100 Years' War with just as much justice as the...
You could, except that was during a period where there were a lot of historians writing contemporary takes. I mean, when we look back at the original 100 Years' War...
Right. Everything has to be retrospective because...
Yeah, it's sort of like who in 1380 was writing the story, but by 1780, boy, there were an awful lot of hot takes about every single...
Do you think that means names will be cemented quicker now? Do you think people 1,000 years from now will be speaking of the War on Terror in the same way we do? Because
I don't know if 100 years from now they're going to distinguish between the first Iraq War and the second Iraq War.
No chance, right?
Because that's 10 years, and both presidents have the same exact name.
This will be like AP U.S. history in the year 2500. It'll be like I always get these confused. Yeah. Which one is George W. Bush?
George Bush, and they're both fighting Saddam Hussein. I mean, how could you possibly make a distinction? But we, of course, see them as, well, depends on what your politics are, but I mean, I guess even now it seems like, really? It was the same damn thing. George W. made the case that he was there to avenge his father's insult.
Right. It must have polled well with Midwestern voters or something.
Yes. They tried to kill my dad.
They certainly won't. They certainly won't distinguish between Iraq and Afghanistan, right?
No, same war. I mean, I don't make any distinction.
Even today, yeah, well, that's not a distinction we make. But, if you're naming wars based on venue, like Korea or Vietnam.
Right. You have to say global war on terror, which is the dumbest and most meaningless title for a war.
And it really does concede, and you can't beat terrorism. So this is just the new normal. By the way, I read a story today about this was really rough for me. Reading a story about the first people serving in Afghanistan who had a parent who served in Afghanistan.
Oh, ouch.
We are now there. Isn't that rough to imagine?
That's a kick in the groin.
It really is.
But of course it is, right?
20 years old. I mean, your shirt could be 20 years old because 9/11 was almost 20 years ago.
I bought this shirt to commemorate 9/11.
Is that why
it's just a blue button-down pinstripe shirt?
But on the back it does have that little the home tie-dyed Twin Towers, and it says "Never forget." That's nice.
No, it says "I don't care, do you?"
Wow.
I think these will be called the Islamist Wars. The
future knows. We're just dinking around here,
right? The Amero-Arab Wars.
Okay, so that's one option. The hyphenated war.
Right.
Very common. You mentioned the Franco-Prussian. That you can tell that's the French name because they put Franco first.
Franco-Prussian. There's the Franco-Austrian.
In German, that's the Deutsch-Französischen Krieg.
Because
they just switch the order.
We do say Austro-Prussian, and I guess that's...
The interesting thing is that America tends to put itself second in wars. It's the Mexican-American and the Spanish-American War.
Right.
And I'm not sure if that's just something about the cadence of the words. Here's what it probably is. We probably used to say the Mexican War and the Spanish War.
That's what it is.
And when we decided to be a little less myopic about it and make it sound a little more academic.
Depends on where you live. I'm sure there are people in Southern Ohio that still call it the Mexican War. They might think we're in a Mexican War too.
I was about to
now.
say they're probably waging it at Walmart every week. So that's an example where it's Franco-Prussian. And they say do 1870. I'm not going to try to say the year in French.
Oh, they actually use it.
Because there were other French-German wars. And so the French will say, they'll call that the Guerre Franco-Prussienne, but of 1870. They'll have to qualify because they've been fighting Germany before and since.
Sure.
It's this. By the way, I looked up Spanish-American War in Spanish. It is Hispano-Estadounidense. So they also use our order.
But it's probably their order.
They'd prefer to have Spain first.
Yeah, they're Europeans, so they put their country first.
Well, if they were really into it, they should have won.
We put our country second because of our intrinsic American humility.
Which we're famous for in time of war.
And also globally famous for, the Americans are humble people.
Well, think about this. Spanish-American.
Yeah.
It's iambic pentameter.
It doesn't work as well.
And you'd have to say Americo, which we have never liked.
Americo.
Like Franco and Anglo kind of work as prefixes in a way that we've never managed with us.
No, I don't like it. I just intrinsically don't like it. If you said Amerigo,
that would be historically accurate.
I'd be into it.
Of course, the names of war, as we've hinted at with Desert Storm, for example, or even the order in which you list the countries.
Desert Storm. The more, it's just one of those things.
It just sounds like a G.I. Joe playset.
Yeah, you accept it because you hear it so often, but when you really,
think about how it congealed into Desert Shield. No, wait, it was the other way around.
Desert Shield went into Desert
Storm erupted out of the steely readiness that was Desert Shield.
And did we call it Desert Storm 2? Do we still call the second version Desert Storm 2?
No, it had its own name, Operation Avenging Eagle.
Operation Avenging Eagle.
Well, one of them's Enduring Freedom. Is that Afghanistan?
Oh man,
it's bad.
They're all so awful, and they feel like those movies that came out after Top Gun, like Iron Eagle, that just kind of tried to take the Top Gun formula
And as we mentioned at the time, they're not Churchillian at all anymore. Now that they're all focus tested to provide a administration approved take on the war. Right. You'll never have anything even as evocative as Desert Storm again, because it'll all have to be restore unity or something. You know?
We're so late stage Roman Empire, and I wish that we could see it. I just wish that the people there congregating at Walmart shooting flags at each other's trucks
without masks
could just be like, wait a minute, this is we are.
You are about to be frozen at Pompeii.
This is so campy, and that is never a good sign. Learn to laugh at yourself.
So the propaganda naming of war.
Well, yeah, like the Edwardian War, the Caroline War, and the Lancastrian War. Who named them those things?
Those seem pretty English specific.
Yeah,
right?
did the Lancastrians name it the Lancastrian War? It doesn't sound like those aren't titles that you name in victory.
And often, as we've hinted at with Vietnam, the same name for the war will often not serve the propaganda purposes of both sides. In 1981, there was a border dispute between Ecuador and Peru over a as yet unsurveyed mountainous area on their border.
There's been a continuous war between Ecuador and Peru over that Punjab, the South American Punjab.
I assume because it's mountainous and therefore, easy to send in little commando units across and do a little dance.
Yeah, make a little love.
And it's maybe harder to survey because of the bad terrain, and less urgent because it's probably settled very sparsely.
And you want it because of questions of high ground or moral high ground?
My guess is it's questions of, just national pride is a little harder to come by, even compared to late state declining America, when you're Ecuador or Peru. So these little sovereignty battles take on a weightier state. Plus, they can be used by whoever's in power at the time to distract Falkland style from the domestic failings of the government.
Right.
In this case, Ecuador was claiming 3 border points, one of which was called Paquisha. So when the bullets started flying over the actual sovereignty of Paquisha, Ecuador called it the Paquisha War.
Right.
However, to call it such in Peru would be a grave insult because Peru's take on the war was that Paquisha, the border point that the Ecuadorians were calling Paquisha, was not in fact set up coterminous with the diplomatically agreed upon location of Paquisha, that this was in fact a false Paquisha.
The false Paquisha.
So in Peru, this is still called the false Paquisha War.
I feel like the false Paquisha is some kind of card gambit. And then he pulled the false Paquisha.
It does seem like maybe in Iraq it should be called False Desert Storm.
False Desert Storm. So was the difference between was the difference between Ecuadorian Paquisha and false Paquisha separated by a dozen miles or 100 feet? Or
it's very short. Yeah. I think it's a matter of a mile or less.
As far as you could fire an arrow.
Whether fake Paquisha was actually over the border or not. And I don't actually know what happened in Conflicto de Falso Paquisha. I don't know who turned out to be does the current border include Falso Paquisha? It's got to be still in dispute, right? Comes up every 6 months. Somebody builds a birdhouse at False Paquisha and starts a pig war. The Brasilia Presidential Act of 1998 supposedly drew the border much clearer. Brazil? How did they get involved? Well, you always go to the regional power, right. the third party, neutral third party to sign the treaty. Right. I'm sure the president of Brazil was, or possibly the Pope was running the talks. I don't know. Somebody's going to have to let us know whether Falso Paquisha was falso or not. The big example for an American audience, as far as propaganda purposes for the name of war, is, as you alluded to earlier, the American Civil War. Because even in America, it's not that it took a long time for the South to accept that was the name of the war. Civil War, even though I think in the Gettysburg Address, doesn't Lincoln say we now find ourselves engaged in a great civil war? Yes. I mean, civil there just meaning related to a citizenry. It's not between nations, it's between citizens of the same nation. The same way a civil defense does domestic defense, right? Right. And that was a well-known, it comes from Latin, and it was a well-known, Civil War was a well-known term in English because of the English Civil War, right. As you pointed out earlier. which is when the Latin, bellus civile or whatever, civile got borrowed into English. But at the time, even though Lincoln uses it colloquially there, small c, small w, that was not really what anybody was saying on either side of the border.
Well, you have to assume that during a war, people just say the war.
Right. You don't need it yet.
Right. It's only when the war is over, because even 5 years after the war, you're probably still going to say the war, during the war. It's only at the advent of the next war
that suddenly, we need a name for the old one.
Yeah.
In the North, the Civil War was almost always the Great Rebellion.
Oh, well, that's giving the South an awful lot of credit.
Well, not really, because it's saying that what it implies is that they are merely rebels within a surviving state.
Oh, I see.
The Southern name, as you'll imagine, connotes a lot more sovereignty. For them, it's the War for Southern Independence.
Right.
They're echoing the American Revolution.
And who said the war between the states? Was that some coinage that came out in Wyoming or something? The later additions to the Union.
The border states actually had their own name. The Brothers' War was very common there because those were states where somebody in a family would have gone to fight for a northern battalion and somebody else might have gone to Virginia.
My AP history history teacher in high school loved to refer to the fact that the Civil War was brother against brother. And over the course of a year, he found a way to inject that enough times that it became a meme among the students in that class. And, we would say it to each other at parties. It was brother against brother fought the Civil War. Why, it was brother against brother.
You're doing an impression of your teacher?
I'm doing an impression of a teacher, doing an impression of someone that was fighting in the mountain territories.
Did I tell you I have an analogous story here where I had a Civil War buff U.S. history teacher in high school? And his
was it AP history?
It was AP history. Yeah. And his thing was, it was IB U.S. history, but yeah, you could take either test. And his thing was always, no matter what you were studying, he was such a Civil War buff that no matter what you were studying,
there was an analogy.
He would tie it to the Civil War, and especially if you were doing 19th century U.S. history, because no matter what we were talking about from the 19th century, westward expansion or agrarian whatever, or the Mexican War, whatever it was, it would end with, and people, that's the Civil War.
That's right.
So we would also be at parties saying, people, that's the Civil War.
People, it's Kansas-Nebraska Act.
No matter what you said, you could say, people, that's the Civil War.
People, that's the Civil War. The Civil War. And I think we had another phrase that was related to brother against brother, and it was, some people are still fighting the Civil War.
Now, let me be clear. Was he doing this kind of Shelby Foote voice?
He was a real character. He had a lot of mannerisms. One of them was he would kind of tap the top of his head
That's like a crazy Monty Python sketch.
He would, like I spit in your general direction. But he would tap the top of his head like this and stick out his tongue when he was laughing. Like, and he was 6'5".
Nobody can see this, but you're kind of patting the top of your head gently with both hands, kind of patting down your hair as you do so.
Both hands patting down your head and sticking out your tongue, kind of wagging your tongue like blah.
Let's put that guy around children.
He was a very strange man. In fact, he gave me an F.
Boo.
But he, as part of a conspiracy among my high school teachers to graduate me, in spite of the fact that I did not have,
did they cut a deal? Another guy with a C bumped you up to an A to make up for it?
No, they cut a deal behind the scenes. And if you look at my high school transcript, I got an F in AP history, but a credit. So somehow in a pre-computer world,
does it have a little line going down the side of the F, making it into an A?
There's an F, and then instead of a 0, because there were a lot of classes I got Fs in that I got a 0 in terms of credits, but AP history I got a credit.
But what if they could see you now?
I know, right?
Your own dirty ravine.
I have communicated with some of my high school teachers over the years.
Do they remember you?
Oh, yeah.
But not in a good way.
No, they do remember me in a good way. I mean, I was just as fun and charismatic then as I am now, which is to say somewhere in the middle of the great human arc. There are people more fun than me, but a lot less fun. And they
you're the fun one on this podcast.
No, that's not true. You're the pun one on this podcast.
That's not fun.
But they all have expressed pride. Like they're proud of me. None of them in the end wished me ill will.
Maybe they're more proud of you because they can see the before and after photos.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think there was the consensus was like, we hope you survive, not we hope you fail. But here's your F. Good luck. Good luck in the world.
My daughter's fourth grade teacher lives in our neighborhood, which means we often see him out raking or whatever.
Did they have a good relationship or a poor one?
She likes it. He's kind of a character. He always wore shorts and a short sleeve dress shirt and a bow tie.
Huh. I was going to say
shine.
I was going to say I disapproved, but then
the bow tie kind of did that save it?
I was like, wow, okay, yes, 2 thumbs up.
It's funny how it could teeter between amazing and amazingly bad, and then the bow tie could.
I thought you were going to say he always wore shorts and Tevas, and I was going to say, nope, out.
Most of those shorts year-round guys do wear Tevas. No, but this guy was a little bit dapper. But he lives just down our street, and so my daughter still sees him sometimes, but she never says hi. And she asked me, Dad, do elementary school teachers remember all their kids? And I actually don't know the answer.
I think a lot of them do. It's part of being an elementary school teacher. You get to know all these kids. You spend a year with them. You learn their names and their picadillos. And you'd have to be pretty unusual, I think, to...
Like if any of my Seattle era teachers actually remembered me when I went on TV, I've never had any confirmation of that and might be surprised.
But it's different. I mean, it's also maybe different with high school teachers.
High school's different, yeah.
But I think I was pretty well remembered by all my teachers up to a point. Maybe my second grade... No, Mrs. Langford would have remembered me until she died.
We would like to hear from teachers of this era or any other.
Do you remember most of your students?
We want a number. What percentage of your students would you recognize at Target 5 years later?
If they came up to you and said, it's me. I mean, maybe you're not going to recognize them, but...
Yeah, what are we saying here? Pick them out of a lineup or have any memory? Yeah, how many of your students would you have any memory of if they greeted you years later? My
high school principal and I would meet whenever he was in town and have drinks and
that's not
sit in the lobby of his hotel and talk until midnight.
But you really shouldn't have been doing that in 10th grade.
That's right. In 10th grade, we did not have drinks.
It's really inappropriate. Don't if you're a high school principal, don't invite
your student to your hotel.
For drinks.
Ken, we've come up with some exciting T-shirt designs in the last couple of months. What can you tell us about T-shirts going forward?
I like the December ones. After years of requests, we have finally decided there should be an omnibus shirt with a mail truck on it.
Yay! Mail truck shirt!
And it's fun. It's got Mr. Zip driving the truck, that kind of nightmare-inducing representative of the post office's zone improvement plan. And he's having a fun time driving his mail truck on its last legs. And it says omnibus. And then there's a different shirt about...
He's kind of ghost riding, isn't he? He's a little bit out of the truck. Like he's only got one arm and one leg.
And he's leaning out the right side, but that is correct.
Yeah,
that's the right side. His hood is up. It's smoking. He's quite a rakish young man. He's a real daredevil here.
Yeah. Huh.
And then this is the de Havilland Beaver, right? You talk about the aviation one because I can't remember what this is.
It is. It's the de Havilland Beaver from the front end.
It's landing on a Alaskan lake with its sea pods, with its pontoons, or sea pods as we call it.
That's right. It's a float plane, as we say in the parlance. It shows its very distinctive and characteristic radial engine from the front. So there's no mistaking the profile of the de Havilland Beaver.
These are some good-looking shirts about some popular omnibus entries. 2 new designs every month, so these will be gone at the end of December. Don't miss out.
That's right. This ad has a time limit. You've got over 2 weeks, so almost 3 weeks.
Go to omnibusproject.com/store. You'll always see the links to our 2 new shirts that our friend Dave has up for us at Mediocrity. You'll also find a link to our TeePublic store where we have a wide array of stuff with the Omnibus logo on it. Hoodies, what else? Hats, I think. Mugs.
Onesies?
Phone cases. Yeah, onesies, but only in adult sizes.
Ha 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 ha. If you show up at my house in an omnibus adult onesie,
Yes, John?
you can spend the night.
How does that sentence end?
Maybe in my guest room, but definitely you can spend the night.
So don't forget, if you're interested in omnibus gear for a limited time only, head to omnibusproject.com/store.
That's omnibusproject.com/store.
I think War Between the States is kind of intended as a neutral coinage for, historians. It's often journalists.
Right.
Who are having to do this kind of recent history framing.
Something you would say in Oregon in 1870.
Yeah. And I guess the Civil War had not yet caught on. And I guess, I don't know if this actually happened, but I've heard, fictional Southerners in books complain that there was nothing civil about it. Not understanding the double meaning. It was called Mr. Davis's War in the North. It was called Mr. Lincoln's War in the South.
No.
And I think Mr. Lincoln's War is the authentic coinage, and Mr. Davis's War might be
just
abolitionist newspaper editors trying to turn it around. Do you know what it was often called after the war?
The War of Northern Aggression.
Well, that's what it was called long after the war.
Oh, really?
The first site I could find for War for Northern Aggression, Jim Crow era, like 1950s.
Oh, what?
So
no.
Yes. Like straight up, nobody was saying the War of Northern Aggression.
No, wow.
Until
it's like the
statues.
The statues from 1918.
Even later, it's post Lost Cause, Gone with the Wind era revisionism, and it's straight up don't let them in the lunch counters era.
That's
revisionism.
Fantastic.
And if you look, and I do not encourage you to Google War for Northern Aggression trying to find early print citations like I do.
Because you're going to get Byron de la Beckworth.
You actually get kind of self-published or small house published homeschooling educational aids that are still lauding the Confederate heroes of the War of Northern Aggression.
Well, and the slaves were happy.
Because, white supremacists got a homeschool too.
Absolutely. If you think about...
You don't want them to get a textbook and have to black out all the parts that say slavery is bad.
My mom is always trying to get me to join the Sons of the American Revolution because the Daughters of the American Revolution played a big role in her upbringing because
and she imagines there's a second group called the Sons?
No, there is.
That's crazy. They don't get as much ink.
The Sons of the American Revolution, the Roosevelts were members. It's an
old Mayflower kind of a thing?
Yeah, the Daughters, I think, is a much bigger and more active. In fact, we talked about George Washington's teeth. Mm-hmm. Mount Vernon was maintained by the Daughters of the American Revolution. So it used to be a much more prominent social organization and sort of a way to distinguish yourself from the wives of your Ohio neighbors that couldn't trace themselves back. And I've never actually joined the Sons of the American Revolution. They send me emails all the freaking time. But I also could join the Sons of the Confederacy, which was an organization, and is, but 30 years ago, it was, in fact, probably even 15 years ago, was touted as a kind of...
Just a regional cultural thing.
Oh, it's just a thing that you celebrate your history, you celebrate your family and your legacy.
It was even a little scholarly to be a Southern Confederate... rememberer? Yeah,
I mean, in the Shelby Foote era, where the Civil War documentary on PBS was like a national event, that kind of like memory of your
benevolent,
your recent history. And I mean, and I'm the first to say that my forebears that fought on the southern side of the Civil War were alcoholic bastards.
Hey,
but in very recent years, the Sons of the Confederacy has become pretty politicized and
for some reason
pretty gross. So when they send me emails, I put them right in the trash.
Well, don't tell them about your new sword.
Although Jason Isbell has suggested that he might be able to get me I guess appointed a Kentucky colonel. And
I know that's been your dream.
I'm encouraged by it.
We keep saying we're going to do Kentucky Colonels for the omnibus, and we have not yet done it.
Maybe if we do it, that will be enough.
That will be the thing that puts Jason over the top.
Yeah, for me to be a Kentucky Colonel.
The reason why, the War for Northern Aggression coinage did not come until
the 50s.
Until basically the Klan wanted
That's like Mussolini making the trains run on time.
in the time period immediately after the Civil War, it was generally called the recent unpleasantness, sometimes with a capital R, capital U, which seems like a joke, like a kind of a understated, like a hilariously understated thing. But people would actually say, as a euphemism, due to the recent unpleasantness, and what they mean is, 400,000 dead or whatever.
I mean, if you think about it, that
is very unpleasant.
It's Walt Whitman-y, right? I mean, people did talk that way, but
it's a little elevated.
Well, but also, was it sardonic? Because that was also the first war where poets and writers and photographers delved into the violence and the surgeries. It was after that war there were a lot of walking wounded. I'm
looking at sites and it doesn't seem to be ironic, at least. Like when you get right down to it, it was recent. It was unpleasant.
Unpleasantness.
Well, and now that's a phrase we use to, when the hot water heater goes out or something.
That's when somebody farts at the dinner table. I'd rather not discuss it.
So these are all ways in which you can name a war. And all these possibilities were considered when it came to the great wars of the early 20th century.
The recent unpleasantness, even?
It's not so recent for us.
The war between the states of the world?
The war between the states and their colonies. The thing about World War I is it did become a world war very early. Like, the tendency is to think, well, maybe it was called the European War before Wilson got in. And in fact, World War I was a world war in August 1914.
Because of the colonies.
Yes. That's when France and the French and British African colonies invaded Germany's African colonies. It's when New Zealand suddenly sent ships to Germany's Polynesian islands. The colonies got hit immediately.
It's the whole story of the Africa Queen.
That's right. Without that, we would not have the African Queen. Mr. Allnut. So German Samoa was invaded at the end of August 1914. This was a world war from the start. And despite that, people would call it the European War because those were the powers involved.
Had there ever been a war that encompassed such a large portion of the world?
Yes. So one of the objections so possibilities like the Great War and the World War were mooted almost immediately because the European War seemed insufficient. It was often called the Kaiser's War or the German War, but I think it was felt on the Allied side like that was giving too much of the spotlight to the bad guy, to the Central Powers. Why make this about the aggressor?
Right.
There's some propaganda benefit to naming the war for the aggressor. This is Osama's war or whatever.
Yeah.
But through the lens of history, you don't want to make him the protagonist, right?
Right.
And one of the objections to calling it the World War is that, that had been in currency since the kind of the simultaneous European unrest of 1848.
Oh, right. Which was, but confined just to Europe. 1848 was a bunch of revolutions that all happened at once.
Yes. But maybe the fact that those were the powers that had already started carving up the world. If you look for citations for Great War, that was used to describe, with a small g, that was used to describe 1848. And if you look for citations for World War, that was used to describe 19th century conflicts.
It's really interesting because those were mostly internal wars or wars of the working classes against the aristocratic classes. I mean, I
wonder if it's the kind of thing where in succeeding decades they kind of did get chunked, the same way the 100 Years' War gets chunked. And, I guess you tend to see it as one movement.
The Russians came in and solved the problem it was international, but interesting.
So we tend to think of, when I mentioned this topic to you, the first thing you said was the Great War. You thought of that as what World War I was called before it could be numbered, right?
Right.
And that was an option, and it was specifically mooted by Maclean's magazine, which is the Canadian News Weekly, the Canadian Time or Newsweek, which I think still exists, but was probably a lot more influential in 1918. And they said, wars name themselves. The Crimean War. Sometimes a war comes up and everyone immediately knows this is the Crimean War.
Right.
And they said, this is the Great War, capital G, capital W. It names itself.
In its moment.
So that was, during the war, they were already trying to brand it as such. But even before the armistice, governments were discussing what should the nomenclature be.
Oh, sure, because it's going to appear on some treaties.
It's going to appear in treaties. It's going to appear in our official histories and commemorative monuments and everything.
What's interesting is that none of these wars, although there is the propaganda aspect of like the order of countries or the regionalism involved, wars never, hardly ever, have judgmental terms associated with it. The War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah, those don't catch on.
No, because if you said the unjust war or the idiotic war, it wouldn't. At least it seems like that never makes it into the record because there's this attempt by historians to be dispassionate.
Right. That would brand you as a biased historian. I kind of forgot about wars that are named for props until you just said that. The wars that have a single MacGuffin that's so irresistible that it becomes the War of Jenkins' Ear.
Yeah,
or
right.
the War of the Oaken Bucket. I'm trying to think of the other ones.
The Pig War.
The Pig War, we've already done an omnibus.
Right.
There's a few animal ones like that. The Golden Stool. There is a Pastry War.
The Pastry War. But these are all
There's a Soccer War.
The Soccer War.
That's
these are skirmishes, though. They're not like...
Yeah, none of those are...
The pig didn't set off a global conflagration.
And that's how you can tell if the war. That's a good rule of thumb. If the war is named for something you can carry with one hand, it probably lasted less than a month.
Can you carry a pig with one hand? A piglet. Maybe. Yeah.
So as the U.S. during the war, as the U.S. is commissioning its military historians to write about the conflict, a Major Johnstone meets with. Oh, I don't think that's his rank. I think his first name might be Major. Meets with a British journalist. Because again, it's journalists and historians that are having these conversations.
Right. With
Charles A'Court Repington to talk about what the war was called. And he said, the Great War doesn't work because that was kind of how we thought of the Napoleonic War in the UK. And the German War, again, centered the Boche, centered the Germans too much. So that was... For governmental purposes, that wouldn't work. And Charles A'Court Repington suggests in 1918 to Johnstone, he suggests the First World War.
In 1918?
Even though there is no Second World War, just to emphasize the unprecedented scale of it.
But also, boy, that seems a little bit looking forward.
Knock on wood. He is not the first person to coin the phrase the First World War. In 1914, the scientist Ernst Haeckel, and
let me guess his ethnicity.
He is German. This is not the most famous thing he ever did. He was actually one of the greatest zoologists and naturalists of his day. Like he coined words we still use today, like ecology and phylum and protist. His most famous work, which was now discredited, is the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Do we not say ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny anymore?
We can say it all the time because it's fun, like 7,000 Macedonians at full battle, but it does not have the virtue of being true.
I see.
We now know that the idea was that as a creature matures in its development, it mirrors the evolutionary development of its species. That's the idea. And that turns out to actually not be a very good scientific hypothesis.
Right, but there was a literary theory aspect of ontogeny recapitulating.
Oh yeah, it seems like one of those things like Darwinism, where once it catches on, people start to see reflections in other sciences and social sciences.
Yeah, right. It becomes a metaphor.
Yeah. So he's best known for that, but. One of the most interesting things he did is as early as 1914, he called the new conflict the First World War. He's quoted in the Indianapolis Star as saying, "There is no doubt that the course and character of the feared European war, will become the First World War in the full sense of the word.
Interesting.
So people were saying First World War not in the sense of as compared to the second one, but
this is the first time this has
such
happened.
a thing has happened. And, Wilson tried to get the war to end all wars going. And
was there
that
any
didn't take.
region? Well, right, because people were like, wait a minute. We'd like to have some more wars. More wars, please.
I mean, that's what the generals probably were thinking.
Was there any region of the globe that was not affected by the First World War? I mean, it kind of extended.
I feel like there was armed conflict on every continent, right?
Yeah.
The
The
not Antarctica.
The Russo-Japanese War was over by 1905.
Russo is another country that does not lend itself to prefixing, and yet we do it anyway.
We do it because what are you going to do?
You can't say Japano. You could say, for China, you would say Sino.
The Sino-Russian
Sino-Soviet.
War would be what you would do in that case.
That seems to be, you can't say Chino. It looks like Chinos.
The Chino-Russian War.
Fought between the city of Chino and Moscow.
Although the Russo-Japanese War didn't play a direct role in World War I, it definitely affected Russia in terms of having sort of bled it a little dry, such that it maybe precipitated the Russian Revolution as part of the First World War.
It's kind of the thing where looking backwards in 500 years, that will all be considered the same war.
Yeah.
The Russian Revolution, Russo-Japanese War, that'll all be the same big ball of wax. So, but despite the fact that there are these very early citations for calling it the World War and even the First World War, like I know from my Anthony poll that for the next 20 years, it was just referred to colloquially, the last war, the first war, kind of the way you're saying.
Yeah.
The war will always be the only war we talk about. The 14 to 18 war.
What did you do during the war?
The war before this one. Yeah. The fact that it's still the war. And
that kind of still works generationally. Like if you see 25 years ago, if you saw a 70-year-old man, you would say, what did you do during the war? You wouldn't have to stipulate.
That's right. And now it works for Vietnam era now. And
right.
We're, as I pointed out earlier, we're perilously close to having that work for the war on terror too.
Right. What did you do in the war?
And the fact that all those other coinages were used so commonly meant that really it had not been standardized as World War I and would not until after World War II. Referring to the Second World War as a world war is largely the result of two people, Hitler and Roosevelt.
Really?
I mean, Hitler was very early always referred to Germany's goal as Weltkrieg, a world war, because, I mean, he wanted to give the impression that Germany was a Weltmacht,
right.
A world power, in the way that, the other powers had agreed it would not be.
Right.
So the war to him was all about, can Germany be on the world stage again? The way to do that is to fight a world war. And there's also the propaganda goal of pointing out the international character of your enemy, not the Allied powers, but for propaganda purposes, world Jewry,
right.
For your own anti-Semitic purposes.
And Hitler's theory was that the Germans were the Übermensch, and so it was a clash between the nations of men.
And they were going to take over the world. Like,
right.
To him, it's a Weltkrieg because, New Germania or whatever is going to be the capital of the world government.
And that the races will be hierarchical, so that the Germans and the Swedes and the Dutch and the British on top, and then the French and Italians and Spanish under that, which I still support.
Interestingly,
suppress the Spanish.
Oh yeah, I mean, if we can all agree on something. The first citation of anyone saying anything like World War II actually happened in 1919. In much the same way that we refer to World War III as the spooky next thing, people between the wars would say in the Manchester Guardian of 1919, they refer to, the possibility, the specter of World War #2, and they actually do the little NO period. And that's the first time so the Roman numerals did not catch on until Time magazine.
So they foresaw it.
Yeah, and for them, it's just like the specter of the next war.
Yeah, the seeds have been sown. So Time...
But Time had a very... I don't know if nobody's going to remember this, but Time had this bizarre house style where they were always trying to coin new words and things.
The Time Style Guide?
Yeah, in much the same way that, the New Yorker will still put a diaeresis over the word preempted or something today.
Cooperate. I'm so
exactly
beat those guys into.
But Time was even more annoying, and I think I should find a list of words coined by Time Magazine. I remember they were trying to get the word cinemactor to catch on in the 20s and 30s.
Sounds like something down by your taint.
It sounds like part of your turboencabulator. You got to see if the cinemactor is aligned.
Yeah, if it has too much grok in the gleamer.
Because they would try to combine the word cinema and actor, and that would be the cool Time way to say a movie actor.
Cinemactor.
Would be the cinemactor. And there are some that actually have caught on. They were also trying to get tennist to catch on as a tennis player.
Tennist.
But the one that actually stuck was... and they tried to get Cinemoppet to catch on for child actors, like a Mickey Rooney would
a
Cinemoppet, and Louis B. Mayer would be a Cinemogul.
Why only in film?
They even had Cinemongenou, which really looks like a sex act when you see it spelled, although not pronounced. The one that caught on was Socialite. I believe Socialite is a Time magazine coinage that actually... So the ones that didn't fail did okay, but at the time, so Time had this kind of oppressively modern house style. Oh, Tycoon, I guess, popularized by Time. So Time had
what is Tycoon a portmanteau of?
I don't think it is. I think it comes from an Asian language. I think it's it's in Chinese. It's
Rangoon,
Tai Kong or something. It's what foreigners called the shogun of Japan in the 19th century, and it was Tycoon in
I see.
This is what, hiragana or katakana? But the idea that you would borrow it for a business leader instead of, at the time it would seem as weird as calling Bill Gates a panjandrum or but the same with mogul. Like we use mogul and tycoon, which used to be kind of Eastern potentates.
Right.
And now we use them for business people. Anyway, so Time had this oppressively modern house style, and they were going to, by hook or by crook, they were going to get World War II to catch on with Roman numerals to the degree that in 1939, the Time story about a German invasion of whatever, Poland or Czechoslovakia or whatever, read, World War II began last week. That's it. That's the quote.
Wow. Crazy.
So they called it.
Well, that was the period of Time's greatest influence, right? Starting then and going through the mid-century.
Although not enough to get Cinemoppet to catch on.
They might have dropped that by then.
But their willing accomplice here was FDR, who was calling it the Second World War as early as 1941. I assume the idea being to get Americans to take it as seriously as they took the first one.
Right. Which they didn't really take seriously.
Eventually. Yeah, I'm guessing World War... I think America always preferred the World War nomenclature during the First World War as well, at least if you weren't an isolationist, if you were pro-intervention.
But America also had a kind of complex about the world and being a part of it, atop it.
Right. Part of it when convenient, not part of it when not.
Right.
But even though FDR really helped, made Second World War the popular coinage on this side of the Atlantic, he had some reservations. In 1942 at a press conference, he mentioned that he was not crazy about the Second World War and he wanted some ideas. And as a result, 15,000 letters poured in with American citizens suggesting what they thought the war should be called.
Hitler's War.
Nothing more American than this. Well, FDR pointed out that he wanted it to have more of the American ethos for joining the war in it. Defending the little guy, defending the unpowerful people, defending democracies.
The war of Japanese aggression.
Exactly. So people wrote in with hundreds of ideas like the war of Japanese aggression. It was the war for civilization, the war against enslavement. These are all too long.
Yeah.
The Free World War, the People's War.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
the Pentagon really, or the War Department, I guess, not the Pentagon. The War Department couldn't do anything with any of these.
No, that's all garbage.
And I'm sure they're not in love with, and FDR in his speeches kept trying out new ones. Like he would call it the survival war in
The
a speech.
survival war.
He would say, are you holding a long cigarette holder?
We
Eleanor?
need to fight the...
He tried the survival war in a speech, only to be told by his staffers that it didn't translate well into French, German, or French, Spanish, or Italian, and also that it conveyed the fact that America was fighting for its very survival.
Right.
In other words, that
tone.
we might be losing. Yeah, it was not triumphal enough. So he was told to back away from that. And yet, every few years, he would suddenly, in his fireside chats or whatever, have some new idea, and suddenly he would try to get the Everyman's War to catch on, or
the
Tyrant's War.
No, that's the wrong way.
That's in 44. He was like, I just have a new idea. We're going to start calling it the Tyrant's War.
Yeah, but
he never stopped trying to rebrand.
There are only two tyrants that you would be referring to, and you would not want some of that tyrant energy to bleed over first onto Stalin and then onto you.
I wonder if that's why he got talked out of the Tyrant's War.
Right? I mean, Mussolini is a tyrant, but not compared to Stalin.
So FDR spent 4 or 5 years essentially trying to make fetch happen.
Yeah.
Because he was not happy with Time Magazine's World War II. In Britain, on the other hand, they did not land on the Second World War. They say the Second World War to this day much more commonly than World War II. The Roman numeral is much more of an American usage, which I guess maybe connotes that kind of Time Magazine forward-thinking pithiness of using Roman numerals for this.
I still struggle with it. And, there's also World War II with the numeral 2 that you don't see as often, but it is a...
Oh, with the Arabic number.
Yeah, WW2.
That's when you see it. You see WW2, I think, as much as you see WWII.
But I still struggle with II. It just doesn't... if you don't hit that caps lock, it can look it can look like a Wii.
It can look like a Nintendo, yeah. As late as 1947 and 1948, the British government was undecided as to what the war should officially be called, because they were then writing their current history. And I guess one of the leading contenders that they were trying to replace was the 6 Years' War. They were going all the way back to the history of the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War.
The 6 years starting in 38.
39 to 45, I guess.
So they were only including their time in it.
Yeah, I guess it ends at Nagasaki, and it begins when Germany invades Poland, right?
Right, but it leaves the Czechs and the Anschluss out.
They're hanging them out to dry because of Neville Chamberlain. It's all his fault.
That's right. That was a great compromise.
And I guess there was actually a conference of Commonwealth powers to decide what it should be switched to, and Australia really objected to the Second World War. I don't know, for reasons of their own. But they were essentially outvoted by history, because in the same year, 1948, Churchill's book about the war came out, in which he called it the Second World War. And two other very influential, big-selling surveys of the war also kind of landed on that. So again, it was kind of the journalists and the historians
and
doing the work the government couldn't. Yeah. So sorry, Australia. To this day, the Soviets have their own name. Do you know what the Soviets call it?
Yeah, it's called the what? Well, wait a minute.
Well, I guess it's not the Soviets to this day, but to this day, the Russians still use the Soviet propaganda name.
The glorious.
That's very much it.
Victorious War.
The Great Patriotic War.
The Great Patriotic War. That's what it is.
And to them, that encompasses a lot of, to your point about the 6 Years' War, that encompasses a lot of grievances that predate the start of the war.
Right. The massacre of all the Polish gentry, the Poles, starving of the Ukrainians. But the Russians have that problem of having sent millions and
having essentially won the war.
Well, and they cannon foddered it.
And not being in the documentaries.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's what, and the Great Patriotic War is a Stalin era coinage that
they should call
used.
it the war of attrition.
It really was. I mean, and we don't even have a word for that war. I mean, we could say the Eastern Front, but even that doesn't include, as you point out, all the obscure Polish and Ukrainian and Lithuanian grievances.
Well, in the Winter War, which no one talks about anymore, except as a component of the, a sub battle of the Second World War.
And so the Soviets are not the only holdout, I guess, because, all these 20th century authoritarian powers that kept their propaganda power longer did not fall for the fait accompli of Churchill's book. In China, I think it's still officially the war of resistance against Japan.
Oh, right. Of course. That would have been their...
That's their focus.
Either primary or...
Sure, London's getting bombed, but...
Sure. Their complete perception of it being the rape of Nanking.
Yeah, well, rightly so. Like if America had been invaded, if any part of America had been invaded, we would still be calling it the Narragansett War or wherever we fought them from the beaches.
Right.
So there you go. Like it may be... so all these things happened after the war is in question. So in many cases, long after. And the lens of history is long. We may still be referring to, who knows what the war on terror or the pandemic or the Trump presidency will be called by people who see it as part of a bigger pattern. And it kind of depends on the pattern they choose to see.
It's funny when we think about the European wars, that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's often confusing to see like, oh, Russia and France were allies during this period, but then all of a sudden they were enemies here and were allied with Germany, and then we're at war with them, and it all feels very, kind of hard to sort. But then we fought Germany the first half of the 20th century, and then all of the subsequent wars, Germany was a close ally. 300 years from now, that'll be like some super boring bullet point on the AP US history test of the future. Wait, at some point they liked the Germans? Yeah. Did it start with the Spanish-American War and go through the Russo-American wars of the 2040s?
I mean, honestly, if we're speaking to future super intelligent crustaceans, like they probably have the mammalian blink.
Yeah, these are the oxygen wars. And that concludes the war before this one. Entry 1409.NH0109. Certificate number 24737 in the omnibus. Futurelings, in the unlikely event that social media still exists in your era, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are archived at Omnibus Project. Our handles were at Ken Jennings and at John Roderick. I'm also on Instagram under the same name. You can email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com or visit one of our fan groups on Facebook or Reddit or Discord. You can mail us actual mail at P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington 98155. I see you opening some mail over there, Ken.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting.
Letterhead from the city of Fort Collins, Colorado.
This is... Wait, you can see that from there? Oh, right. It looks like one of our correspondents wrote to us from the back of his announcement of pothole fixing on his street. We got from our listener, Jim, who wants us to do an episode on Niihau, the forbidden island of Hawaii, an example of the Pacific garbage gyre trash that washes up there. On the day he got this, he saw a Sears Dynaply car tire and a plastic toilet and this emergency shower sign.
No, that's cool. I think you've got it faced the wrong way that way. But it looks like there's a fish.
Why is he looking up? What is happening there if it's like this?
I think that might be...
this guy seems like he's just... Maybe this is somebody that just is blasting his tunes?
I don't think that's a guy. I think that's wear and tear on the thing. I think that's... that does not look like a guy.
You don't think this is an eye and a nose?
What's wrong with his mouth? Oh, I see what you're saying.
Imagine a mouth here.
Oh, okay.
But really, is this like in case of chemical burn, head to this shower?
Yeah, I think so.
But then why is he blasting himself in the face with it? I guess he really got it in the eyes.
That's what it was. That's what it would be.
Well, we don't know because this is just detritus from the ocean. That's very interesting, Jim. Thank you for sending us your garbage.
Yeah, how cool.
And Kurt, who suggested a show, and I don't know which one, sent us what? What do I get? I get an ironic USDA shot glass. Why does the USDA make its own shot glasses, I wonder?
I don't know. Is that
Is this
to take your vaccine?
Do they put beef hormones in here and
right.
and feed them to the cows? And you
inoculate yourself with spoiled meat.
And you got coffee Julies. Do you know what this is? It's shaped like a coffee bean, but it's large and metallic.
No. What is it?
I don't know.
Coffee Julies?
Joulies. Oh, it must be some Shark Tank thing because it says #make Mark Cuban richer. The shot glass was bought at the USDA gift shop. The USDA headquarters is designed from prison blueprints. I wonder what the gift shop is then.
Food grade. Here's what coffee Julies are. Food grade phase change material. Sealed inside a thin, polished stainless steel shell. They absorb heat from your coffee or tea, quickly cooling it to the perfect temperature.
Wait.
The stored heat is slowly released as you drink, keeping it warm.
It stabilizes the heat of your coffee.
It's food-grade phase change material. So all you have to do is want that stainless steel bean in your coffee cup, which I don't.
Well, I like how they've made them look like beans to try to get over your nausea on the point.
Yeah, it just seems like one more weird thing to put in your coffee. Is it going to change the taste, make it stainless steel taste?
Well, it's definitely going to fall into your teeth I guess you sip coffee from above.
Right.
As long as you don't chug at a certain angle, you're not going to have to worry about a stainless steel phase change bean falling into your teeth.
Let me see that thing. One more thing to clean is what it looks like. Oh, there's 5 of them.
Oh yeah, was I not clear? This is a 5-pack of coffee Julies.
They're not heavy. Coffee Julies.
So here's the thing it does. It makes hot coffee cool and it makes cool coffee hot. It's like the opposite of a thermos.
Okay.
Or the McDLT packaging.
Okay. All right.
Have you ever wanted something that would make hot coffee cold or cold coffee hot?
I never get coffee hot enough. And it always seems to be getting too cold. So maybe this will solve one of my problems.
Are you a little jealous of my USDA shot glass right now?
Because I don't collect shot glasses or use them for any purpose because I don't drink.
I am going to have a 1 shot glass collection, and it's a USDA. That's what I rep. Like, I didn't pick a sports team. I didn't pick a national park. I just love the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Yes.
Thank you for sending us those things.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Also, if you want to support the show directly, we would appreciate your support at patreon.com/omnibusproject. Your financial contributions are what keep the show afloat.
Literally the only thing. Because, would you or I do it for fun?
Sure. I mean, we're basically just doing what we used to do when we would meet for tacos.
But we're so busy. We're not going to do it like twice a week.
Right. That's true.
The show would happen without your donations. The show would happen every few months, and it would have chewing in it.
Ken would fly back from one of his glamorous adventures, or I would. Our glamorous adventures being of very different stripes, and we would meet at a taco truck, and Ken would say, "Did you know that the wars weren't called World War I and World War II until long after?" And I would say, "No."
I'm going to drink out of my shot glass. Here's to you, John.
Cheers. Do you want one of these Julies to keep the hot side hot and the cool side cool?
No, I'm afraid it will make my water hot or something. I don't want phase change happening in my shot glass.
Phase change.
Listeners, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived. We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may be our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.